when I think about some of the principles of resilience, one of the things that I like to say is what happened to us is not our fault, and healing is our responsibility. So I start from that place. And the next place I start is we all have resilient stories. And those resilient stories oftentimes are the stories we most don't want to tell. And yet the stories that most need to be told. Most need to be told to integrate those experiences, to reinforce or solidify our own resilience in those moments. And later on, when we've been able to integrate those experiences, to also shine a light on the path of others, right? To be part of someone else's survival guide, to be an encouragement to those that are coming up behind us.
Today, I have an incredible woman for you, and this is being recorded on International Women's Day. So I'm really excited to have this powerhouse woman. But before we go any further, since I know you're going to love this podcast, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. So today, our guest is an expert. She's a living, breathing expert on the topic of resiliency. She was the head of executive leadership training at companies like Nike and Cigna. Like, talk about name recognition. And she's written a book, and she talks about the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. And we're going to dive into that and so much more. But let me just introduce you to Dr. Taryn Marie. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And it's just a delight to be here with you, Dr. Patty Ann.
All righty. Well, thank you. So resiliency, like, you've probably always been way ahead of the curve, because resiliency is really the buzzword today. But before we delve into that, I'd love for you to share with us who you are as a person, not just as a resiliency powerhouse executive coach. So give us a little insight. Let us be a fly on the wall for a conversation between Dr. Taryn and all her peeps from when she was a little girl.
From when I was a little girl. I love it. Well, you mentioned the book, and that's going to be out on April 18th, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. And one of the things that came up for me when I was writing the book is my editor asked me, to tell the readers how I got interested in resilience. And so if you had asked me that question, I don't know, even 2 years ago before I was writing the book, I would have talked about being in graduate school. I would have talked about doing qualitative interviews with these amazing women who were mothers living in rural Maryland, and they were experiencing some level of food insecurity or financial instability. I would have talked about then a couple of years later being on pre- and postdoctoral fellowship and working with people with brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. And
wow, that's heavy. That's really heavy stuff. The injuries.
Yes. Yes, we can talk all about the neuropsychology and the incredible people that I've had the opportunity to meet as part of that work in neuropsychology and rehabilitation psychology. And what I found was with these sort of rural mothers living in Maryland, and then these folks that had had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, who are largely male between the ages of 18 and 25, right? I mean, obviously there's
so what was it? Was it like car accidents, or what was? Why so young?
Yeah. So for traumatic brain injuries, the largest
TBIs.
population are men ages 18 to 25, which is largely attributed to risk-taking behavior and, at times substances combined with risk-taking behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you have people later in life who are also sustaining traumatic brain injuries and what we would call organic brain injuries, right? Traumatic brain injuries from falls, typically in later life, and strokes and aneurysms are the kind of the organic, without trauma to the brain. And so what I found in these two populations is that transportation was the thing that promoted resilience in two groups of people that were seemingly dissimilar in every way, right? For folks
what do you mean
that
by
had
transportation? What do you mean by that? Transportation?
Yeah, access to your own vehicle and your ability to operate it. And so for people that had sustained traumatic brain injuries, this might seem like sort of a baseline thing, right, for a lot of people, but actually many people don't have access to their own transportation, right? So this was the difference statistically for people that had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. If you had access to your own transportation, this is the difference between living in an assisted care facility versus being able to live independently if you had a vehicle and you could get to your appointments, right? Because then you're able to access your care and you're able to rehabilitate after your injury. Whereas those that did not have access to transportation, their outcomes were not as good, right? And this is in the days before.
So hang on one second. So I want to go to that because I find this interesting. So basically it speaks to having an element of independence, right? Is that the differentiator? If you're independent, you can get from here to there without needing other people?
I think it's a measure of financial independence, right? If you think about what financially goes into having a vehicle, right? I mean, there's the car payments or the purchase price of the vehicle, there's the insurance, there's the license, there's the registration. And so people from lower socioeconomic statuses, simply didn't have access to their own vehicle, right? Didn't have necessarily the financial independence yet to be able to transport themselves. Or in the cases of the people with the brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, they also may not have had a family member that had the financial independence to have their own vehicle to transport them.
It's so interesting. I forgot you said underserved population. So I have to go here. I just have to, because for the listeners, we were chatting before we got online, and Dr. Taryn is coming to us from Philadelphia, and not from a political perspective. I don't want to go into politics, but you have a senator, John Fetterman, who just sustained a serious brain injury. How does any of your work correlate to what he's experienced now? Because the suggestion wasn't, I know nothing. Like, I don't know anything other than what everybody else sees and reads, that, he really was not doing well during the campaign. And that perhaps, I guess he's had a history of depression, but perhaps the campaigning prevented him from the opportunity to heal during a critical window. And then it played a role in him experiencing depression now. Is anything going on with that? Because my understanding is that strokes are happening to the population younger and younger. And I find that somewhat disturbing as well. So can you speak to that as the expert? I'm really fascinated to know what you're going to say.
Oh, great. Well, fantastic. Well, there's a couple of questions here to unpack, right? So I think...
Sure, of course, you know me. Pile them on.
So I think, maybe there's at least three questions on the table, right? One is, related to a specific person who sits in political office, right? Another is kind of the general elements of rehabilitation trajectory after brain injury and what might facilitate a better rehabilitation and what might detract from that. And then the third, I think, is, what we're seeing, on trend, if you will, relative to kind of age and, organic brain injuries around stroke and aneurysm, right? So, yeah, we've got our work cut out for us. I like it. Yeah.
Yes, please.
So let me say, I've never worked directly with, Senator Fetterman. I haven't, seen his bio.
Yes, and we're making that clear to everybody. Like, nobody has any personal information, right? I'm just asking Dr. Taryn because, geographically, she's right there. So I'm sure she's on top of the news, but just she's just going to share with us her wisdom based upon her experience. That's all, because it seems to be more prevalent. And so let's go right to the source.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we say in rehabilitation and neuropsychology is if you've seen one brain injury, you've seen one brain injury. It is so deeply nuanced in terms of the type of injury, the severity of the injury, the various structures across the brain that are impacted, by this injury, the person's age, their physical and mental health prior to the injury, their diet, their exercise, their stamina, right? All of these things. We can't sort of decouple, right, the person and who they are, who they were before the injury, right, from the injury itself and the person after the injury, right? So a couple of things that I can tell you just for people in general, right? The first thing is the greatest gains that people typically make after a neurological injury, a brain injury, are typically occur within the first 12 to 24 months after injury. So those are the greatest gains that we see. People continue to get better and better over time, right? Because we know about neuroplasticity. We know that our neurons are constantly regenerating, rewiring, regrouping to support us based on, the experiences that we're having. So our brain is just this incredible, constantly malleable, moving organism that lives within us. But we know the greatest gains occur, between 12 and 24 months after injury, right? So, and then people continue to get better and better over time, but the gains won't be as pronounced, right? The second thing is what we find is that fatigue and depression are very common symptoms of brain injuries, right? Now, some people may have had depression within their mental health profile prior to a brain injury, right? So that's something we would want to assess for. Is that something that existed for this person prior to the injury? Is it related to the injury? Has the injury exacerbated what was already there, right? And then fatigue is very, very common, right? It's just as if, you sort of break your leg and maybe you ran, a couple of miles every day, but now just walking on crutches, from the car, into a building for an appointment is exhausting, right? Because you're exerting a lot more energy to transport yourself. The same with the brain, right? You're exerting more energy to do, cognitive and neurological processes. So, those symptoms are very common in a profile of someone that's had a traumatic brain injury. I really admire, the fact, for anyone, right? Senator Fetterman or any person who has a life-changing injury like that and works very, very hard to not allow that injury to stop them from contributing at the level, that they desire to contribute in the world. And, what that means, I think, is that sometimes there's trade-off decisions or trade-off experiences, right? Where campaigns are grueling for anyone. Yeah. And then someone who is having residual symptoms relative to a traumatic brain injury is going to, need to be even more aware of that, right? And navigate and manage their energy accordingly.
So was his stroke, do you know, was his stroke within that 12 to 24 hour window of when he started campaigning?
Months, you mean? Was it within 12 to 24 months?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know when I don't even know if it was a stroke. I don't know if it was an aneurysm. I don't know the nature of the injury that he sustained, and I don't know when it occurred.
Okay. So that's, I thought it was a stroke, but I could be wrong. I personally feel if it was a stroke and within that 12 to 24 month window, I don't know. I appreciate what you said, but for the life of me, I don't think anything's more important than your health. So to me, it would be stop the presses and let's take care of the health, whatever that issue might be, right? But that's just me. But I just want to go back to that window. Is there anything within, I thought I'd heard something at one point within the first 48 hours, and then like the chance of having another stroke after the first stroke. And then when the strokes are done, is there something that occurs from the neuroplasticity perspective within 48 hours and then again within 6 weeks? I don't know where I heard that, but I'm feeling like I've heard that.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what you're referring to there. What I can tell you is something that very few people know is that blood, like blood in our body, is toxic to our brain tissue, right? And a lot of people don't know that. And so one of the reasons that aneurysms in particular, and also strokes, are so devastating for people when we have, what physicians or medical professionals may refer to as a bleed, right, in the brain, is that blood, when it touches the tissue of our brains, our neurological tissue, is actually toxic, right? So we actually have a barrier inside of our brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier.
Blood-brain barrier. I remember that. Yeah,
right.
You said it. Yeah.
Which is meant to keep the blood, right, away from the brain tissue, because blood is toxic to brain tissue. And so when someone has a traumatic brain injury, for example, say in a car accident, right? When you're in a car, you too are traveling at the same speed as the vehicle, right? So say you're driving 60 miles an hour, then you're in a car accident, right? So now you've been traveling 60 miles an hour and you stop suddenly, right? And you stop, and then sometimes, the car will turn or it'll twist or you'll try to miss something. And so the constellation of injury that we see there is an injury oftentimes that occurs across the entire brain, right? Because you and your brain were traveling at 60 miles per hour. Then there's a sudden stop and a sudden turn. And so the brain might be bouncing off the skull, and we see this kind of twisting and shearing of neurons across the entire brain. Whereas with an aneurysm or a stroke, where there isn't an external trauma necessarily, right? Where there's a bleed in one area of the brain, what we typically see there is a much more pronounced impact to functioning, right? Whereas a traumatic brain injury is like often across the entire brain. So we'll see lots of ways that our thinking, our emotions, our physicality changes, right? With traumatic brain injuries. With a stroke, if you have a bleed, say in your left temporal lobe, right, kind of right here on your brain, this is for most people your speech center, how you understand speech, how you generate speech. And so you may have no other impact to your brain other than where that bleed or that, aneurysm occurred. And yet you're having trouble understanding speech or creating speech in a very pronounced area. So that's kind of how the difference is between injuries. And it's what, for me, I think is so fascinating about how our brain works. And then what happens when we're, sort of exposed to these really unfortunate moments where the brain is injured in some way, right? And then how we effectively support people in rehabilitation, not only for themselves, but one of the contributions that I'm really proud of that I had the opportunity to bring to this field is to think about not only how we effectively bring together the mind, body, spirit of the person who had the traumatic brain injury, right? Because in the medical community, we were just focusing on, did the person live or not, right? Like that was, quality, if you die, quality of life 0. If you live, quality of life 1, right? And that's how it gets entered into the spreadsheet. But there's a whole array, as we know, of experience that exists between, dead and alive, right? And so what I really wanted to do, Dr. Patty Ann, was in that time to be able to bring forward an opportunity to support people, not only in their physical rehabilitation and their cognitive rehabilitation, but their emotional rehabilitation, their spirituality, their identity, and to expand the aperture of that intervention and that support to their family members, right? To their parents who might be taking care of them, or to their significant other, to their children. Because oftentimes what we found is that the experience of one person having a traumatic brain injury in the family was actually more difficult for the people that became caregivers than the person who sustained the injury themselves.
Well, I think it depends upon the severity of the danger. And I just experienced this with somebody close to me, so I totally get it. But go back a minute. So go back to the initial question. What got you here? You started to say if it were before you wrote the book, different things. But was the little girl Taryn, would she recognize the incredible professional grown-up woman Taryn, or did you have different interests and different passions?
I think little Taryn would be blown away.
Because
little Taryn is continuing, little Taryn that lives within inside me, let's say, is continuing to learn about the capabilities, the strengths, the talents, the unique ways that I get to contribute to the world. I was thinking about this quote that Steve Jobs said, right? That we all get to make like our own little dent in the universe, and little Taryn would be tremendously blown away by the little dent that big Taryn is making in the universe. Never in little Taryn's wildest dreams, would she believe that she would be the head of executive leadership development and talent strategy at Nike with the C-suite, with high-level athlete partners, overseeing the development and advancement and mobility and assessment of our top 400 vice presidents, right?
Okay, and why was that? Why? Who were you? Who was little Taryn? Like, be little Taryn, not little Taryn within you. Be little Taryn. 8-year-old Taryn, right? You could think the world is 8 years old little girls. We think the world is our oyster, right? I mean, it's such an innocent, beautiful stage.
Yeah. I feel like I might get a therapy session out of this too. This is great.
No. I mean, I only do coaching, but I just feel like it's so interesting what you're doing. And so many people, like, for example, you just mentioned Steve Jobs, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think Steve Jobs would have thought he would be the Steve Jobs adult that he was, a Steve Jobs, the little boy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me say two things about that. So one is, little Taryn grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Oh, you're from Michigan. Oh, okay.
Yeah. The oldest child and oldest grandchild on both sides of the family.
Oh, yeah, my goodness. The second coming.
Maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. How many children were in your family? How many siblings followed?
One.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my brother and I. My mom stayed home with us. Mm-hmm. She was a speech pathologist, and she'd been an airline stewardess, and she stayed home with my brother and I.
Well, I think speech pathology is knowing the brain a little bit too. I mean, I see that.
It sure is.
Bit, right?
It sure is. Yeah. And my father was the special agent in charge of the Ann Arbor and ultimately the state of Michigan's FBI office, Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Oh, my Lord. Listen to this. I love this. Keep going. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
So he was a law and order kind of guy. Are we allowed to say that? I mean that respectfully, like positively.
Absolutely.
Right? The FBI.
In fact, one of the things that my dad and I did growing up, like sort of how we bonded, he's sort of a man of a few words and, doesn't always feel emotionally available, even though he has a very like tender heart. We would actually watch Law and Order growing up together. That was one of the things that we did together. So that was spot on.
Well, he was a product of his generation,
mm-hmm.
right? Men weren't very emotive at the time, right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so 8-year-old Taryn, she's very into mermaids. So that year in 3rd grade, I was a mermaid for Halloween. It's probably still my favorite costume. We I don't know if you ever did this as a kid, but like when I got out of the shower, like the night before, my mom braided my hair and then we unbraided it right before the school parade. So I had all the crimpy mermaid hair, which was amazing. That's a very beautiful memory. Something else that was happening at that time.
I couldn't have done that because I had a pixie my whole life, but I get it. My sisters did. My sisters did. Yes. And I totally get what you're saying. And it's beautiful and I'm envious. Keep going.
So second grade, really kindergarten through second grade, that was the moment, or those were the moments that I found myself in the lowest reading group in school. I had a lot of trouble spelling. I, for the life of me, had trouble differentiating or reading like the words hoped and hopped, like which was which and how many consonants did you add on, was very, very confusing for me. And so I thought for a period of time, like, well, like maybe I'm just not that smart. Right. And then there was another voice within me that said, I don't believe that. Right. Because there were ways that I was thinking cognitively and analytically that I could tell were on par with my peers or above. And so it didn't make sense to me as 6, 7, 8-year-old Taryn why I would be able to reason in such a way and then be in the lowest reading group in my class. So these are the days, I think, before like hooked on phonics and stuff. And, you know,
we didn't really talk about learning disabilities and dyslexia. And, you know, it was, in many schools, it was handled so poorly, you know?
Yeah. So what I did is really between the summer of second grade and third grade and into the fall semester of third grade, I decided that I was going to teach myself to read and spell in a way that made sense for me, because the traditional educational system, I couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
Right. And I did. And in third grade, as 8-year-old Taryn, I moved from the lowest reading group to the highest reading group.
How did you do that? How did you teach yourself? If you truly had like a dyslexia, a learning disability.
Indeed, I was diagnosed with dyslexia at age 37. So
not until then?
Oh, not until then.
So even more impressive. What tools did you use? If you had, that would be like, I have very, very bad eyes, believe it or not. Like I am almost legally blind. No joke. I wear custom made contacts. I'm lucky I can see. My point is, if I would try to read without contacts, like as a kid, or without glasses, everything would be a blur. I would not know how to read, not because I was dumb and couldn't read, but I literally could not see. So with dyslexia, that is the same analogy. So how did you do that? This is amazing to me.
Yeah, I guess building on the analogy that you shared, I found sort of the prescription, if you will, like in the sort of realm of prescription glasses, of how I could learn in a different way. And so, for example, like vowels are really hard for me. I get confused about vowels. They sound very similar in my head. So whether it's an E or an A or an I or an E and I together, right? And so what I started to do is I started to
sometimes Y and W.
Yeah. So I started to group words together that were similar, right? So if you think of like the word neighbor, right? That Neigh, right? Way, it sounds different, Weigh, right? So I started to put words together that were similar so that I could remember that like neighbor goes in the same category as way.
Totally
right?
Get it. Totally get it, because words were, so the issue was that most words, especially English words, are not phonetically. If you phonetically sounded it out, it would make no sense. So you did create your own. That's amazing. So you go into third grade and now you go from the bottom to the top group.
Yep. I go from the bottom to the top of the group. I'm going to be diagnosed with dyslexia, but not for 29 more years. So I'm going to make it through all of my education and my doctorate degree without accommodations.
And what was your doctorate in, Taryn? What was your doctorate in?
neuropsychology, and I got a master's in marriage and family therapy.
Okay.
Along the way. So, yeah. And so then at age 14, I had what I refer to, I've thought of a lot of words to describe this, and this is the word. I had a stalker show up at my window when I was getting dressed in the morning for school. He through a window cracked on the bottom. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and his face, was kind of pressed against the window. And after I'd gotten dressed, I noticed this sort of face at the bottom of my window. It's dark outside, light in my room. He kind of stands up, the light goes down his face. I don't recognize him. I'm flipping through my, sort of experiences so far in my 14 years to try to explain what could be going on. I remember this time my dad was outside, maybe trying to scare my brother and I. So I, I think to myself, well, maybe my dad's just outside, playing a trick on me, so I'm like, Dad, and he's like, take off your clothes. You're beautiful. I'm like, not Dad. And so I, go running from my bedroom. We make a police report, and the police say, there's probably nothing to worry about, just a, fluke, someone passing through the neighborhood. So this was in October. So fast forward now, 8 months later, I always kept that window that was on our driveway closed. But we also, I don't know if we didn't have air conditioning or we were just trying to save money with, but I had a window open that faced the back of the house with the screen. I'd tried on some new clothes that I'd gotten at the mall that day. And as soon as I was completely naked, I heard the voice again. And he said, I've been waiting a long time for this. Now, my parents are out of town, and we have babysitters. Yeah, we have babysitters staying with us that are upstairs, but they have 2 little children of their own. So they're engrossed in sort of the swirl of what is the nighttime routine of little kids.
Right.
So at the moment when I saw him there standing right outside with just the screen between us, 3 things became true for me. 1, my childhood bedroom, which should have been the safest place for me, became profoundly unsafe. 2, I was naked in front of a man for the first time. And 3, this was not a fluke. This was not a fluke, as the police officer had suggested, or perhaps hoped, right? So I'm calling for help, and the babysitters can't hear me. And he says to me through the screen, no one is going to come and help you. Now, this is in the days before cell phones. However, I was getting good grades in school, and my parents had given me my own phone line and my own phone in my bedroom. And so what I did is I picked up the phone and I dialed 911 myself. Right. And so this went on for 2 more years. There's at least 2 other instances where his behavior escalated.
It went on for 2 more years.
He continued to come back and to target me when I was either home alone or my parents were out of town.
Did they catch him ever? This was before Ring. You could have had Ring today, right?
That's right. That's right. So when I went away to college, my mom called me early one morning, and a neighbor that lived 4 houses away across the park that my parents lived on had been arrested for brutally raping and attacking another woman in our neighborhood. And it looked as though this was the person that had been coming to my window for those years in high school. His behavior had escalated. He'd been in and out of drug and alcohol rehab, and he went to prison for 20 years for that attack and that assault of the woman in our neighborhood.
And do you think it was you? It was him?
I do. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that house is diagonally across the park from where my parents live. And every time he came to the house, my parents weren't home, they were out of town. So it's someone that knew the house, knew the cars, could see when people were coming and going. So I think, circumstantially, right, the evidence is very, very strong. So he went to prison for 20 years. And I too spent time in captivity because I had developed post-traumatic stress disorder.
Of course. Yeah.
And so I met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD for about 20 years. And one of the opportunities that I've had in my adult life, as I think about resilience and mental health and well-being, is how I understand who I am as a person, separate from what it means to be someone that was exposed to a significant amount of trauma very early on, right? Because that hypervigilance, that sense of stress, that sense of fear got programmed, in my mind and in my body at a very early age. And now recognizing, not everyone feels this level of hypervigilance. Not everyone feels this level of fear, that, this isn't something that's normal or natural, because I never got to adulthood, before the exposure to trauma and to PTSD.
Right. So, well, thank you for sharing that. I am just, as a woman, right? It's such a violation of your innocence, if you will. It is such a violation, in the sense that, can I ever be safe? Will I ever be safe? What is safe? So let's go to current now, right? Because I always like to get to the past. We're not a slave to it. It doesn't define us. But I would imagine it certainly informs the work that you do. Probably it is not that you'd ever in a million years want it, but most of our traumatic experiences, really, if we reframe it and have our mindset around it, it really very much becomes our superpower, if you will. So talk a little bit about. So yes, I know, all, the Nike and the Signet and all that stuff. But what really informed your brilliance was probably so much more of your pre-doctoral work, right? Because of who you are, because we're just like the brain. Like people say to me all the time, do you ever get tired of coaching and hearing, because there's patterns? I'm like, no. I said, what's amazing is there's common denominators in behavior. Absolutely. But every person is so unique and so, to use your word, so nuanced. And I love being able to capture that and expose it and to reframe what they maybe carry as a negative as, no, this is a positive. We just have to literally reframe it, right? So how do you do that in your work with resiliency? And I'm sure it's part of the pearls of wisdom you share in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things that I would say to sort of set the table here, right? The first one is, when I think about some of the principles of resilience, right? One of the things that I like to say is, what happened to us is not our fault. And healing is our responsibility. Right? So I start from that place. And the next place I start is, we all have resilient stories, right? And those resilient stories oftentimes are the stories we most don't want to tell in some ways. And yet the stories that most need to be told, right? Most need to be told to integrate those experiences, to reinforce or solidify our own resilience in those moments. And later on, when we've been able to integrate those experiences, to also shine a light on the path of others, right? To be part of someone else's survival guide, right? To be an encouragement to those that are coming up behind us. And so our resilience stories, this is a story about what happened, right? And what we get to do, and what I've done, is to create also a resilience narrative, right? So the story is what happened. The narrative is the story about the story, right? The story we want to tell ourselves about what that experience means. And to your point, how we go about reframing it, In my work personally and professionally, I know that there's a number of people like Meg Jay, for example, who have talked about, kind of our trauma and loss and difficulties as being a superpower. I'm also careful about using that language because I think it can feel really unattainable to people who are just grappling with the trauma or the making sense of an experience and in that moment and thinking like, how could this ever be my superpower? How could I ever find a sense of gratitude for what happened? Even if I didn't choose the experience, how could I even feel grateful for this, circumstance? And so
it's interesting you say that, because I rarely use that term superpower, but it just came to me. So I rarely use it. And many times I don't like those kind of words. And I hear what you're saying, the superlative. So thank you for correcting that.
Yeah, well, and maybe not to correct it, but to offer a different perspective, right? And I think the fact that you used that word, and maybe you don't tend to use it, actually opened up a beautiful dialogue and an opportunity to talk about how, that can be of value and of service. And also, to your point about the nuance, about the individuality, about the uniqueness of each person, it can also serve, I think, to demotivate and to feel inaccessible based on where people are in their journey. And so there was one other thing I was going to say about that, but I lost my train of thought. So we'll come back to it.
Sorry. I'm sure we will. I'm just so mindful of the time. And even though I knew I could speak to you forever when we first got on the call, the interview, but I know you want to talk about the 5 principles. And I definitely, towards the end, I will tell people where to get it, how to find out more about you, but just share in an encapsulated way those 5 principles that you share, because I love when somebody has had an experience that they then have healed from, have grown from, and now they share their wisdom with others. It's like, I'll be very honest, you might not like this, but I am never listening to a child psychologist who didn't have a child. I'm just not. Maybe that's wrong of me. Maybe that's my bad, but I'm not, right? Although I can't imagine there hasn't been anybody that hasn't had to overcome resiliency. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, a couple of things to sort of tee it up. So one way that my work, I think, is differentiated from other things that you might read or see on resilience is that I talk about resilience as being the essence of being human. So often we talk about resilience as a binary, like either I'm resilient or I'm not resilient. We talk about resilience as being outside of ourselves, as something we've got to go get or find or cultivate. And so the frame shift here is just as we kind of think about coaching, right? That, we have within us what we need. We are sufficient. We are enough. And it's about sort of mining, right? Those elements of who we are and finding and cultivating those capabilities. Our resilience is the essence of being human. And so it lives within us, right? And so what I say to people is I'm not going to teach you to be resilient, because we all already are resilient. We have faced, with some level of courage and consistency, every loss, disappointment, rejection, turn of events, diagnosis, all of it. And yet, here we are, we're still here. Second thing is, we all as humans experience challenge, change, and complexity, or as I call them, the 3 C's, right? And so this is, if resilience is the essence of what it means to be human, challenge, change, and complexity are the fabric, the rich tapestry, part of the rich tapestry of our human experience. And what that means is we no longer need to feel bad about facing the 3 C's, about facing challenge, change, and complexity, because we know that this is part of what it means to be human. And so given that, what I've done is I've interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data, asking people about how they effectively faced challenge to understand if there were common practices that exist between all of us, that in that moment of challenge, when we feel lost and destabilized and we're asking ourselves, what can we do? We actually have a blueprint or a playbook to know what to do next, right? Mm-hmm. And so these are the 5 practices of highly resilient people that, based on interviewing hundreds of people and collecting thousands of pieces of data, I uncovered, right? And so these are the things that will create a more positive and productive outcome. And so the first one is vulnerability. Vulnerability is also misunderstood. It's allowing our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experience to match what we share with the world. And that's a sense of coherence. That's a sense of cohesion within ourselves. Vulnerability is the foundation of authenticity and empathy. So this is very important, in the corporate world and in our professional relationships. As we look at wanting to have more authentic and empathetic leaders, we also and first need to teach people to tap into their vulnerability in order to cultivate that empathy and that authenticity in leadership. Now, why aren't we all running around living our most fabulous, vulnerable lives, even though we've heard that from other luminary folks like Brené Brown? Well, I uncovered something called the vulnerability bias. And what the vulnerability bias seems to be is kind of a hardwired voice that lives within our head that maybe is evolutionarily supported because, hundreds or thousands of years ago, if we got separated from other humans, we would probably die, right? We relied on one another in community. And so if we think about sharing something vulnerable, there's a voice in our head that says, that's a terrible idea.
Don't do it.
Please don't ever do that. Don't embarrass us like that. Right. And the voice goes on to say, if you share something vulnerable about yourself, the 3 L's will occur. People won't like you, they won't love you, and they might leave. Right. And so we're like, whoa, that's a powerful prohibition, staying in my vulnerability cage. And so this irrational fear around the vulnerability bias is the opportunity for us to continue to flex and build this vulnerability muscle in the midst of challenge. Why? Because when we allow our outside self that we share with the world to match our inside self, we burn less energy in terms of trying to run 2 different operating systems. We get more information. We have connection. We have support when people really know what's going on with us, right? So high level kind of overview of the first practice of vulnerability. The second practice is the practice of productive perseverance. This is the intelligent pursuit of a goal, knowing when to maintain the mission despite challenge and knowing when to pivot or even quit and go in a new direction in the face of diminishing returns. The third practice is the practice of connection. This is first and foremost the connection to ourselves, trusting our gut, knowing ourselves, integrating all parts of ourselves as we might in internal family systems. And then from that place of enoughness, from that place of deep connection to ourselves and our intuition, to then cultivate connections externally and navigate the interplay of the connection with ourselves and the connections with others. The fourth practice is the practice of gratiosity. It's a combination of the word for gratitude and generosity, being able to look on an experience, and even if we wouldn't have chosen the circumstance, to say, I can see the good in that. I can see gratitude for what happened, typically after some time. And then osity or generosity, being able to share our resilient stories generously with others to solidify our own resilience and to allow others to learn vicariously from our story. And then the fifth practice is the practice of possibility. So being able to keep ourselves out of the way of buying into perfection and instead focusing on progress, and then effectively navigating the relationship between risk and opportunity that emerges anytime there's a challenge in our path. And those are the 5 practices of highly resilient people.
That's great. And I love everything you said. I love the vulnerability piece in particular, because when I work with vulnerability, I tell people it is the prerequisite to empathy and to intimacy. You just said it much more eloquently. So before we get to your book, I just want to ask you one more question, because I know we're running against time here. I usually have 2 questions. I have to figure out which one I want to ask. I think I'm going to ask you this one. What is the one song that you can't live without?
There's so many, right?
Just one.
There's just one. I'm gonna go with a title that was actually in your question. So I'm gonna say One by U2.
And how come?
It's such a profound song. I've been playing it on repeat since high school, and it's meant many things to me over time. It's meant my own oneness and my own sovereignty. It's meant, it talks about a relationship there, right? Where the person continues to be hungry and continue to look for connection, even though this person is there in their life. And so that sort of interplay of like wanting to be in a deeply connected relationship that simply, doesn't exist. And then I think the third stanza of the song, actually, if you break it into three, is incredibly hopeful, actually, when I have looked at it recently about the future. And it's about connecting deeply with ourselves and creating, a future and a set of relationships and a reality. This is what it means to me. I think it's actually about Buffalo, but this is what it means to me. And creating, a life that is in service of, what we want to experience and create for ourselves.
Well, I love that. And it's so thoughtful and so deep. It's absolutely, it's incredible. So where can people get your book? The 5 Practices of Particularly Resilient People by Dr. Taryn Marie. Where can they get your book? Or where would you like them to get your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is live. We're in pre-sale right now. The book is at live April 18th. So you can pre-order it. You can pre-order it anywhere you like to get books. It'll be on Audible. I read the audiobook, which was a lot of fun. You can get it on Amazon. If you go to my website, which is, I'm sure you'll have it in the show notes, right? Which is resilience with a C -leadership.com. You can click on book there. And actually, if you buy it through the website, you'll have the opportunity to download the first chapter for free before the book goes live. Great. Oh, I cannot wait to get my hands on this. I am so grateful to you and for who you are, what you've overcome, and how you are sharing all of your strengths and your wisdom with everybody, not just in this book, but through all your coaching and all the other wonderful work that you've done and that I know you'll continue to do. So thank you so much for being a guest here today. Thank you so much. It's an honor and a delight to be here. And I'm just so happy to be here with you, Dr. Patty Ann, and your incredible listeners.